Book 3, Part 7. Maybe we can talk to your alpha and get him to let you run, Mark tried. Then he and I both laughed. Yeah, like that was going to happen. Cal shrugged. I'll talk to him if you want. I plopped back down on the blankets, shooting another quick look the way they had left. It's okay. The guys are having fun, and I don't see Ryan giving the okay for me to go. I rubbed my side. I seem to have a way for finding trouble, or it finding me. I shrugged, and Cal laid down on his side, propped up on one elbow. The buck? You heard about that? I groaned. Yep. But with me out there with you, they wouldn't have had to worry about you. He flashed me a soft smile, and I chuckled. The scent of musk had died down, but it still flickered in his eyes. His very nice, dark brown eyes. I cleared my throat and looked towards the fire. So, no more drums? I guess not, he replied, the smile still in his voice. The guys were gone for 2 hours, and I was trying to enjoy the conversation where I was. Cal was charming, Mark was funny, and I was having a good time, even though I kept glancing out at the trees. I knew they were safe and just enjoying themselves. I did miss them a bit, but I envied them more. I wanted to be out there with them, running hard in the forest. I think we're boring her, Mark sighed playfully. I blinked and turned. Oh no, I'm sorry. You aren't boring at all. Wow, that sounded lame. She wants to run, Cal stated, and glanced towards where our alphas sat. They were on a bench, their heads close together, but Ryan kept watch on me as well. He went to stand, and I grabbed his arm. No, please, I'm okay. I could pretend I was about to do something extremely brave and go demand they let you run. He smiled, settling back down. But I was just going to go toss a few more logs on the pile. Oh. He leaned back on his elbow, his face now closer to me than it had been. But since you want me to stay. I rolled my eyes and smiled, pulling my knees to my chest and leaning back on my hands. I never said that. Oh, so you want me to go? He whimpered, but the smile still danced in his eyes. Boys. I turned to Mark. So, Mark, do you have a girlfriend? That made this wolf fidget a bit, and I wondered if I had said something wrong. Cal chuckled. Yeah, he likes a girl in town. I gasped, and Mark shrugged, pretending to be interested in the empty platter of food. Cal leaned forward, his mouth next to my shoulder. She's a human, though, and Will isn't happy about that. My eyes widened. Then I saw the sadness in Mark's eyes, and I frowned. But if he has feelings for her, it shouldn't matter. Part of me couldn't believe I was saying this. A full human and a werewolf was never a good mix. There were too many issues. Longevity was only one of them. But Mark was still looking down, and my heart ached for him. It wasn't fair. What color is her hair? I asked quietly, smiling. Mark blinked and looked up at me, his brows wrinkled and his eyes watching me to see if I was mocking him. Finally he shrugged. Red. Well, that was something you didn't see every day, at least not in my part of the world. I leaned forward, crossing my legs in front of me. Is it long or short? He watched me a bit longer, trying to figure out if I was playing with him. I kept my eyes soft, but showed interest. It's long, just past her shoulders. Ugh. Were guys always this hard to drag information out of? Straight? Curly? I prodded. His shoulders rose and fell, but I saw a small smile. It's kind of wavy, not too wavy. She keeps it pulled back most of the time. Then he sat up and the smile grew. I found out that she worked at one of the local general stores, that she was shorter than me and had blue-green eyes. The fact that he knew her eyes so well said a lot for him, and I turned towards him to give him my full attention. Cal had scooted next to me and would lean into my ear and provide more information. "She sounds wonderful," I whispered, and Mark nodded. "I'd love to meet her," I said, without thinking. That dropped the smile from his face, and I wanted to kick myself. Of course I couldn't meet her. Then I tilted my head. They had been told about my problem with humans, whatever that was exactly. "Very few of the townies are allowed up here," Cal stated, and he actually sounded sad for his friend this time. "So, you go and see her?" I asked carefully. Mark shrugged. "We go into town for supplies now and then." I rolled my eyes. "That's it?" Then I shook my head. "You need to do better than that, Mark. Does she have any idea you like her?" He blinked at me hard and I shrugged. A girl needs a lot more than an occasional trip to her store. Come on, even I knew that. "Will would never let us," he whispered, his voice heavy again. "Why not? Humans and wolves have partnered plenty of times. It's not like it doesn't happen," I stated, laughing and keeping my voice light. That was true, too. With female wolves being so hard to come by, most males had to seek mates outside their race. It was just a fact. When he replied, it was under his breath, and I tilted my head. "Sore subject," Cal whispered, and I bit my lip. I reached out and put a hand on Mark's shoulder. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pried." Mark smiled at me. "It's okay. And even though I can't ever do more, it's nice to talk about her." He shot Cal a look, without being ribbed for it. "We're just jealous, Mark," he smiled. "At least you have your eye on someone." "And you don't?" I chuckled, turning to look at Cal, who was still sitting closer than I felt comfortable with. He shrugged. "No one has caught my eye enough." I thought, but I ignored it. I turned back to Mark. "But you have 5 females here." Mark nodded, smiling. 2 healers, who are almost as old as Tom Tom. "Mary and Shelley are mated," Cal put in. Then he looked at me. "They're the ones that are pregnant." "And the last one?" I asked. "Al's age." I giggled and he shrugged. "At least my brother's got a fair shot." Just then we heard another howl and I turned. It was close and it was Phil. "They're back!" I exclaimed, twisting around to look in that direction. I think Cal sighed, but I ignored it, looking through the darkness. Finally, I saw them. They were trotting, and Phil was in front this time. My heart sped up a bit. I had missed them. The group made their way over, Jackson and Rock still nipping at each other, and they were all panting. "Looks like you all had a good time," I chuckled. Their fur was damp from the run, and their paws were thick with mud. I leaned forward and picked a few leaves out of Phil's fur. "I am a bit jealous," I smiled, as I tossed them to the ground. He nudged my arm, and Track moved up. His mouth opened wide as he caught his breath. His eyes were happy, and he gave a hard shake to free the bits of the forest in his fur. "You guys need a bath," I teased, as I plucked a few leaves off him as well. Rock shook himself, and I put my hands up as small twigs and leaves were thrown free. Ryan had walked over and knelt next to me, forcing Cal to move back a bit. I bit my lip to keep my smile inside. "You can stay shifted if you like," he said, looking at Phil, who snorted. Ryan looked at the others. "I think I could use a run myself," he said, which also meant he was seeing who wanted to go with him. Phil barked and then nudged me. "Go!" I laughed. Running with the Alpha was a treat, and I didn't want him to miss out. Ryan turned to me. "You stay put," he winked. When I rolled my eyes, he stood and headed off, all the wolves following him. I sighed, watching them go. Don't worry, I'll find a way for you to get a good run in, Cal smiled. I didn't turn. My alpha was running with my clique, and I wasn't going with them. My heart ached a bit, and my nose tingled. Chapter 8. Aaron and David walked back over to us on 2 legs, and I noticed the glow that comes after a good run. I sighed again and turned as they stopped near us. We're going to get some food, David said, patting his stomach and smiling. Cal gave a nod, looked at me, and then shrugged when I shook my head. Mark jumped up, and the 3 of them headed towards the houses. I watched them go, just for something to do. I know this place isn't what you're used to, he said as they walked away. I looked at the ground, watching the light of the bonfire dance across it. It definitely wasn't, but I couldn't put my finger on too many details. My brows wrinkled as I fought the odd emptiness in my memory. Why couldn't I remember? When someone brought up a subject, I was fine, but if I tried to do it on my own, it was just a fog or a complete blank. I knew who I was. I knew my past. I just couldn't recall it, if that made any sense at all. Did I say something wrong? No, I whispered, then turned to him, and for some strange reason I told him about my memory issues. He listened intently and sincerely, no mocking or chuckling, which was a relief. I feel like I'm losing my mind, I said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. Cal sat up, his eyes serious but soft. I don't think you are. When I frowned, he nodded. You've been through a lot, more than a lot, and everyone has their own coping mechanism. He tapped his forehead. Some aren't so lucky and go mad. When I gasped, he shook his head. No, I mean stark raving lunatic mad, and from a lot less than you. He looked at the bonfire for a minute, then smiled back at me. You're stronger than any female I have met. Even most males, he chuckled then. I think your mind is shutting down what it doesn't really need right now. Stuff you already know, so that you can focus on what's happening now. I bit my lower lip, chewing over his words, then smiled. I liked his explanation. Whether it was true or not was a different story. He shrugged, and I watched his large shoulders move up and then down. I looked down at his hands that were crossed over his lap. They were big and strong. They were used to working hard, and I suddenly had a strong urge to touch them. I remembered the feel of them from before, and my muscles twitched, wanting to move. I cleared my throat and looked away, clasping my own hands together in front of me. His clique came back with wooden trays of food and cups. They ate and chatted, keeping the conversation light. It was nice to meet new wolves, and I was laughing at their stories when the others finally came back. There were no howls to announce them this time. Jackson ran across the clearing and almost knocked me over when he got to me. I laughed and pushed him off me, or tried to. He was heavy and wet and smelled like the forest. He flopped across my lap on his stomach as if I were a pillow, he was claiming, his tongue hanging out of his mouth as he panted. Ugh, Jackson, you're soaked, I laughed, pulling my hands up. They were now wet and covered in tree needles, leaves, and dirt. Jackson's head tilted back and my eyes widened. Don't you dare, I gasped as his tongue stiffened. He was either about to lick the stuff off my hands or was aiming for my face. I didn't want to find out, and shoved his head back around. Track was the next one up, and he leaned down and bit Jackson's backside. Jackson yelped, jumped, and moved over, making Cal scoot back. I moaned when I looked at my lap, and Track nudged my arm. Phil was next to me now, and he gave Jackson a hard bark, which caused him to lower his head and give a small whimper. It's okay, I chuckled, trying to brush the muck off my lap and the front of my jacket. It was pointless, though, and I flicked my hands in the air. Cal grabbed the edge of the blanket and pulled it up. I went to take it, but he took my wrist and began wiping my palm. Phil moved closer. He wasn't growling, but his tongue was in his mouth, and he was eyeing the other hard. Rock walked up on two legs, the same glow and smile as Cal's friends had. He stopped and frowned as Cal wiped what he could off my now filthy hands. Thanks, I stated, pulling them out of his grasp. How is it that we're the ones running, but you got covered in? Rock looked over at Jackson and chuckled. Just had to do it, didn't you? Jackson barked, then whimpered again when Phil growled. Let's get you inside and clean you up, Rock stated, leaning down and taking my hand. The other stood up when I did, and I shrugged. I'm okay. I don't need to go in just now. There was a soft pleading in my voice, and then Ryan walked up, also on two legs. He looked me up and down, and then his eyes moved to Jackson. I bit back my smile. You should probably head inside anyhow, Ryan stated, his voice still heavy with the excitement of the run. I frowned, but it's still early. And we still have plenty of stories to tell each other, Cal chuckled, sounding a bit nervous. Ryan looked at the owl saw click alpha, which is what he obviously was. Then he turned back to me. You're calling it a night, he stated quietly, softening his voice but letting it rumble at the end. My head lowered and I nodded. Thanks for keeping me company, I stated, looking at Cal and his friends. How humiliating. Cal wasn't smiling. He looked at Ryan. The bonfire was for her, he stated harshly, then cleared his throat. Maybe she could... Reina is my responsibility, young one, my alpha stated in a low but hard voice. We appreciate all your pack is doing, but her care is my job. With that, he looked at me, and I quickly stepped off the blanket. For some reason, Rock reached out and took my hand. I didn't look back as we left. I was too embarrassed. Why did I have to go? It was still early enough, and I wasn't tired. Then I yawned, as if my own body wanted to mock me. I wasn't tired. Rock gave my hand a soft squeeze, and Phil nudged my leg and then trotted off towards the parking lot. He's gonna go shift back. I know, I snapped, harder than I meant to. Part of me wanted to apologize. It wasn't his fault. But my mood was foul, and I kept my lips tight as we entered the logged house. I unzipped my coat and yanked it over the hook near the door, dirt and all. Track was sitting and watching me carefully, but I ignored him too and walked into the bedroom to change. I decided on pajama bottoms, since I obviously wasn't going out again, and tugged a long-sleeved t-shirt over my head. The bottoms were soft and dark blue. If I wasn't so irritated, I would have really enjoyed them. Not knowing what else to do with my dirty clothes, I folded them and sat them near the hearth. My hands were still dirty, so I walked out, through the room of wolves on two legs and four, and into the kitchen. Phil walked in while I was taking my frustrations out on the pump at the sink. He waited while I washed my hands and face, and then handed me a towel. I dried myself off and then laid the towel over the edge of the counter and stood looking at it. I'm sorry you had to come in, he stated. I know you were enjoying yourself. I looked up at him and my anger melted. His eyes showed that he really wished I could have stayed, and also begged me not to rip his head off. How could I stay mad? When he realized it was safe, he took a step closer, and I shrugged. It's okay. He took one of my hands, and I sighed, the feeling washing over me. Comfort, happiness, and something so much deeper than both. I looked at our hands, and then he lifted my chin. "I am sorry for all of this," he whispered, the brown eyes soft and full of emotions. My brows crinkled and my pulse picked up. What did he mean by that? I remembered watching him get into the other bed, him leaning in to kiss me, and then his lips landing only on my cheek. Was he sorry that we were somehow bound to each other by this thing everyone called wonderful? My fear choked me and my eyes watered. Of course he was. He didn't ask for this either. "Tay," he whispered, "I'm not sorry that." I blinked hard and watched him, waiting. He smiled, his hand still gently under my chin. "I'm sorry for tearing you away from everything, but I am not sorry for loving you." The butterflies exploded inside of me, and a small gasp came out. I was so very confused, but hearing him say he loved me made my heart pound. How could he say he loved me and yet not want to be close to me? I still didn't understand that. He leaned a bit closer, his eyes on mine, and my mouth opened just a little. The sparkle in his brown eyes mesmerized me, and once again the rest of the world faded away. There was no cold wooden floor under my feet, or heavy wood scent in the air. There was only him. He took a step closer and leaned in, those butterflies bouncing around wildly inside of me. I felt his other arm move around my back, and I gave a small moan. Was it a minute, a second, or something longer? I had no idea. I couldn't take my eyes off of him, and could feel the pulse in his hand under my chin. He smiled, then leaned down, and finally his lips touched mine. A wave of emotion crashed over me and then ran through me in an instant. His lips were soft and warm, and somehow my arms ended up around his neck, pulling him to me. My chest rose and fell fast, and I lifted up on my tiptoes to kiss him back. He moaned, and his arms held me tighter. The world was gone. There were no other sounds, only the beating of our hearts and the soft moans that were coming from one or both of us. One of his hands moved up my back and cradled the back of my head. My eyes closed, and my body responded to his touch, wanting more. Then a door slammed. We both froze, and my eyes shot open. He moaned, but this time in frustration. The world reappeared, and I sighed as the kiss broke. We heard voices in the other room, low but aggressive. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like arguing. I bit my lower lip, my arm still around Phil's neck. He watched me for a second, and then leaned forward again. The voices rose a bit, and he pulled back, this time growling louder. I chuckled, and we both turned. There was no one in the doorway, but we could see the others standing around in the room. Ryan looked our way, and I leaned into Phil's chest, not wanting this to end. He stroked my hair and kissed the top of my head. "I think they're trying to get our attention," he whispered, smiling. I inhaled slowly, drinking in his scent, and didn't respond. I couldn't be the one to step back. I wanted to stay there in his arms. He gave me a soft squeeze and leaned into my ear. "I would stay here all night if you wanted me to." Then he chuckled. "But I think we're affecting more than just us." My eyes widened, and I looked up at him. He winked, and I frowned. That wasn't fair. So we couldn't kiss without everyone knowing, or worse, feeling it? I snorted. This bonded protector thing was getting on my nerves. When he finally moved a bit, I sighed, and he kissed my cheek. "We'll find some alone time soon." That made me smile, and we stepped apart, though he reached down and took my hand. I squared my shoulders and we walked back into the living room. Everyone was on 2 legs now. Rock, Jackson, and Marcus were standing near the door. Track and Ryan were in the center of the room, and they were all looking at us. I moaned again and quickly looked down at the floor. Another hand squeeze of support, and Phil walked us further into the room. Gads, my first real kiss with him, and everyone here had to be in on it. What I wouldn't give just to be normal. Ryan stepped up and cleared his throat. I both envy you and don't, he stated quietly, which made me look up. He was smiling then, his eyes wet but his face dry. Then he looked over at Track. It wasn't as intense this time, but they all went on high alert. Our alpha looked around the room. It was like they were preparing for an attack. My head tilted and Phil looked towards the door. Jackson shrugged. Don't ask me. I felt that whole weird tingly thing, but then I just got this jolt and my adrenaline went off the charts. Track nodded. It was like being really happy and really paranoid at the same time. He gave a nervous chuckle at the end, and I turned to Ryan, my questions in my eyes. Our alpha shook his head. I wish I knew. Then he addressed Phil. I felt something, like being at home and sitting in my favorite chair after a big meal. He smiled and shrugged. Then I got a bit nervous at the same time and had to come check on you. He looked past us to the kitchen. Not sure what happened to the others. The others? I whispered. Ryan nodded. Will said that sometimes it's stronger than others, or was with the couple that was here. They never did try to figure out triggers or causes, he huffed, as if that was something very stupid. Phil sighed and I looked up at him. He winked at me and then turned back to our alpha. Maybe the effects will ease up on you guys, he stated, laughing at the end to show he didn't want the same outcome for himself. That made me smile. Rock shook his head. Man, that's amazing, though. Jackson's head bobbed. I second that. Marcus smiled. I think you two could tame a mad bear with that thing. I bit my lower lip. Okay, this was edging back to embarrassing again. Ryan's head shot up then, and he had one of those silent visual conversations, first with Phil, then with Track. I really did hate that. But I didn't ask what they were talking about. I probably really didn't want to know anyhow. A soft knock on the door made me turn, but made Rock and Marcus jump and then crouch facing it. Ryan walked over and called out. Will responded, and our alpha opened the door. The man walked in, his eyes moving to me, then to Phil, and finally to Ryan. He had a small smile on his face, and his body language was relaxed. When no one spoke, Phil squeezed my hand. Let's get you into bed, he stated, and started walking towards the bedroom door. What? Why? I wanted to hear what they were going to say. But again, my mouth stayed closed, and I walked across the room and through the other door. Phil started to turn down my quilts, and I sighed. I'm not tired. He looked at me, and I frowned. Why do I always have to leave when you guys look at each other that way? Before he could answer, Rock walked in and held up something. Want to watch a movie? He smiled. It was a portable DVD player, and he wiggled it in his lifted hand. Battery should hold for a few hours. Phil chuckled, and I sighed again. This was their way of telling me I had to stay in here while they talked. Why I didn't demand to be out there, I don't know. Maybe part of me really didn't want to hear it. I finally nodded, and Rock walked over and sat on my bed. He put the player on the quilt and lifted his leg, untying his boot. My wolf turned to me. "I'll be back," he stated, and I gave a slow nod. He kissed me softly on the lips, squeezed my hand, and left the room. Rock yanked off his boots, pushed himself back up on the bed, then patted the spot next to him. I chuckled and walked over, climbing up next to him. We sat sideways, with our back against the wall, as he opened the device. "I put one of your favorites in." "In other words, you put one of your favorites in," I chuckled, and he shrugged, then pushed the start button. The sound of the movie was odd in this place. It didn't belong, but it was a nice change. I grabbed the pillows, shoved one at him, and we snuggled up to watch his favorite movie. Out in the front room, Phil shut the door behind him and stepped out into the main room. The others were seated now, and Will smiled at him. "Come and sit," the older man said. Ryan watched his packmate walk over and sit on the couch next to him. He was still trying to sort out what had happened, and Will gave a small chuckle. "I think I know part of the problem." All eyes turned to him, and he sat up in his chair. "I talked it over with Tom, and we both think that the intensity is partly because they're trying so hard to be careful with it." He looked at Ryan. "You all are." "What exactly does that mean?" Track hissed, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at the bedroom door and then back at the other man. "Well," Will stated, also looking up to the door before continuing, "it could be that, because they're not allowing themselves to just enjoy it, that when they do, it explodes," Jackson finished, and Will shrugged. Ryan drew in a slow breath. "Is this purely speculation?" The older alpha nodded, but then replied quickly, "Speculation based on several years in the company of an AOT couple that didn't have the issues these two have." He glanced at Phil. "You are too worried about the other part of her life, and so you hold back." When Phil frowned, he nodded. "She's torn as well. Doesn't know what to think about the different signals you're throwing her." "Excuse me?" Phil snapped. Ryan's head bobbed slowly. "You're holding back. And then well, it almost makes sense." He turned and looked at Phil. "I know why you do, and I'd do the same in your shoes, but it does make sense. It can't flow freely. You've corked it. For honorable reasons, but you do. Then, just like now, when you let it go." Phil frowned. "I can't. She doesn't remember. It's not right." "Like I said, I understand, but..." He turned back to Will. "It could explain a lot." Track leaned forward, keeping his voice down. "So, if they didn't hold back and just let it out, it wouldn't be so extreme?" "Oh, it would be for them," Will smiled, "but the effects on the rest of us might not be." "How was it with the other two?" Marcus asked, also keeping his voice down. Wolves had good hearing, and they wanted to make sure she wasn't hearing the conversation. "There were times it did the same to all of us," Will replied, smiling more now. "Was amazing, but..." He shrugged. "Day to day, it didn't do this." He looked around the room. "Their protector got edgy at times, but if you dam up a river, it will constantly fight to push through. Let the river flow freely, and it will only overflow when there's a heavy rain." Ryan nodded. "So, when there's a surge of emotions more than normal." Will nodded back. "Yes. If she got upset or her move topped, good or bad, the results were felt by most of us. Normally, though, it was just like any other day, and you had to be physically close to them to get that apple pie feeling." He laughed at his own joke, but the others nodded, completely understanding the comparison. "I can't," Phil whispered, with anger and sadness mixed in his voice. "I don't envy you the struggle," the Owl's Saw Alpha replied. "I'm just here to state what seems obvious." He looked at Ryan. "So, you can use that as you decide what to do next." Then he stood, again glancing at the closed bedroom door. "Not a lot, I'm afraid, but—" He shrugged and headed to the door. When he opened it, he turned back. "Don't think for a minute we regret bringing you here." His face was hard and serious. "And don't think we won't stand with you if needed. You're among friends here. We're like family now. Having shared this does that to us." He smiled, looking outside and then back in. "It's good to feel that again." Then he left. Phil was looking at his hands. "I can't. I already feel guilty for what we're doing." He looked up at his own Alpha. "I hate that it has to be this way. I feel guilty when I look at her. My heart wants to love her completely, but my head keeps throwing the reality of all this at me." Jackson moved over and knelt in front of the two of them. "Then maybe it's time to stop." Phil's head lifted and Jackson nodded, watching his friend. "Maybe it's time to confront the bats and end all this." Ryan watched the two talk, then Track shook his head. "Her father will snatch her, no matter what we say. He'll claim we've used magic on her, and we'll take her away and we'll never see her again." Phil's eyes widened. That was not an option. He glanced towards the door, and knew that one part of all of this was true. If he lost her, he would die. Jackson gave a soft growl. "Then we'll make sure he can't snatch her. We go and meet them without her there." "And we would be mounds of dirt before the sun came up," Track shot back, having a hard time keeping his voice low now. "There's nothing we could tell or show that man that would convince him this is real. He wants her back and won't care about anything else." Marcus moved closer, so they were all in a huddle now. What if he saw her and Phil together? If he felt what we feel? "Magic, remember," Track sighed, plopping down on the coffee table. "He thinks we found witches and put a spell on her." There was another knock on the door, and Marcus walked over to it. When Cal announced himself, he opened it. "Thought you guys would be hungry," he stated, lifting up a wooden crate that also had a wooden tray over the top. Marcus moved and Cal stepped in, Aaron behind him with a large jug of water and a stack of cups and a few plastic quarts of juice. They set the stuff on the coffee table. Once Track moved, and Cal started to take out the food. "I think we can manage," Track snapped, although he didn't know why. He actually liked the other wolf when he wasn't flirting with Reina. Cal and Aaron stood, glanced at the bedroom door, then turned back. "If you're going to confront the vampires, you've got our support," he stated, keeping his voice low. "We'll go with you," Aaron added. Ryan smiled, standing. "We appreciate that more than you know." He walked over and put a hand on Cal's shoulder. "You don't know us, or even know if what we did was the right thing. Actually, we know more than you think." When Ryan's brows lifted, Cal nodded. She and Phil bonded in her wolf form, and she didn't remember. Her father, a vampire, hooked her up with a full vampire and was rushing them into getting married. Phil gave a low growl, but Cal continued, giving a very quick but very accurate synopsis of what had happened. "How do you know all that?" Jackson whispered, a mixture of anger and awe in his voice. "We do our research before we invite anyone here." Ryan nodded slowly, sensing these two were holding back on information as well. He knew they meant what they offered, and he didn't doubt their abilities, but they knew more than they were telling. Just then there was a loud thud from the other room, followed by a grunt from Rock and a laugh from Reina. Ryan chuckled and Cal smiled. She is something else. When the others stiffened, Aaron shrugged. Well, we better get going. Cal blinked, looked back at the bedroom door, then nodded. So just let us know. Ryan nodded back and the two left. I don't like that, Track whispered, stepping up next to his alpha. Ryan looked at him, his eyes suddenly tired and a bit older. Track sighed. This was wearing on all of them. Not that they wouldn't fight every day of their lives for her, but maybe it was time for this battle. Phil drew in a low breath, looking at the faces of his friends. He saw the same thing in their eyes. They were all tired, no matter how loyal their hearts were. His own selfishness was keeping them out here, away from their homes and the rest of the pack. His eyes moved to the bedroom. It was time. Easy there, Ryan stated, putting a hand up. We need to talk about this and decide what we will do. Track nodded. You can't just march in there and tell her about them. Not like that. Why not? Phil hissed, the frustration oozing through him. He was sick of playing this game, of making sure no one slipped up and reminded her of the other part of her life. The young vampire's face flashed in his mind, and he gave a deep, threatening growl. Her father was powerful, but what they had was greater than anything that man could pay for. Ryan shook his head. If you go in there and dump all this on her, it'll overwhelm her. His own jaw was clenched now, not at his wolves, but at the need for what lay ahead. Phil and Reina should be living happily back in Polson, not hiding here like criminals. We have to take this slow, and I want to talk with their elder before we do anything. Why? Jackson asked, his brows high. I want to know what they aren't telling me. With that, he walked over, plucked his jacket from the peg, and shoved it on. The others went to follow, but he put a hand up. Stay here, was all he said, as he walked out the door. Ryan hurried down the path, pulling his jacket tight around him. The air was cold, now that the bonfire was burning low, but that wasn't what was causing the shiver to run through him. Taking her from the vampires was one thing. Pulling them all away and hiding them was another. But making contact with them? Trying to find a way to get them to see Phil and Reina? He growled as he headed up the steps to the main cabin. The lights from the dying bonfire still flickered, and Ryan stopped as he heard someone call his name. When he turned, he saw the older man with his walking stick heading his way. He stopped and waited. Looking for me? Tom stated, without making it a question. Ryan nodded, and the elderly wolf gestured towards the main house. They both finished the walk up to the door, and Tom entered it first. It was empty, but the fire crackled softly in the hearth. The old man laid his stick against the wall by the door, and then made his way to the couch. Ryan stood until the other one sat, and then took a chair next to him. What do you know about all of this? Ryan finally asked, leaning forward in his chair. Tom shrugged. Not much, I'm afraid. Do you have a dreamer? The Polson Alpha asked carefully, but closely watching the older wolf across from him. Tom's mouth curled in a soft smile. His eyes danced a bit, and he gave a small nod. They knew she would come, or more, that she needed our help, and we needed to bring her here. When Ryan frowned, the other shrugged. Dreaming is a lost art, my friend. Those that happen to show the slightest talent have no others to train them. He sat back and shrugged. So, it's an image here, a clip of a dream there, with no one to help them piece it together. How many dreamers do you have? Ryan asked, unable to keep the awe out of his low voice. 2. You and little Al? Tom Tom chuckled. Little Al and his half-brother Cal. Ryan's eyes widened, and he turned and looked towards the closed door. Cal? Why didn't he tell me? Partly, I suppose, because he's a bit embarrassed by it. When Ryan's brows rose, Tom Tom nodded. Dreamers are extremely rare. We both know that. When a wolf claims to be a dreamer, others are in awe, but also expect them to be able to do all the things the stories say they can. They can't seek answers and have them answered like our ancestors could. Those pups are at the mercy of whatever's shown to them and have had to learn to interpret those dreams without a proper mentor. I still don't understand, Ryan stated, looking over at the fire. Dreamers were extremely rare. Many generations went without passing on the gift. This pack had 2. No point in doing so, the old man stated, as if that made perfect sense. They knew she was coming, that she needed to be here. He rubbed his aged hand over his chin. Cal had a dream of 2 figures, both male, standing at the end of a path. She stood at the far end, deciding which path to walk down. Before Ryan could ask, Tom Tom held up one hand. We can speculate on who those 2 figures are, your wolf and the young vampire, but they were only shapes, so we have no way of knowing. They were just standing at the end of a path? The old man nodded, and Ryan scrubbed a hand through his hair. I know we have to confront the vampires, but to be honest, I haven't the slightest idea how to convince them that she and Phil are... He sighed and looked down at his hands. I have never felt so un-alpha-like before. Tom Tom chuckled. Good that you don't. If you were high and mighty at a time like this, I'd say you were a fool. As for the other part, who's to say it's you that must convince them? Ryan looked up and the other shrugged. Why do you think that burden is yours? Or if it is, in part, why would it be in whole? Ryan blinked and Tom Tom leaned forward. I doubt there is any one voice, even hers, that could convince the bats, as you call them. So what do we do? It wasn't uncommon for alphas to seek out elder wolves for advice, and he was desperate for some now. You start from the most logical point. Which is? Tom Tom smiled. The beginning. Ryan growled. The man was talking in riddles. He had already talked to Reina's father about the night in the woods. That was the beginning of the bonding. He thinks we have found witches and spelled her. Does he? Yes. Are you so sure? Ryan stood. Elder Tom Tom, with all due respect. He was getting irritated now. The other man nodded. What I mean is, are you sure that's what he really believes, or is that what he wants to claim, so that the wolves look like the evil ones in all of this? You mean? Ryan drew in his breath. He looked around the room slowly, drinking in the statement. You mean he knows that Aote is real? I know of this man, her father, Tom Tom stated, letting his eyes wander towards the fire. He's a wise and very powerful man. He knows that there are no more witches with any real power, and even when there were, they still couldn't do such a thing. Love potions, yes, but those were always false and went so badly they were deemed evil and not practiced. He looked into the fire. It would seem more likely that her father knows Aote is real and is panicking. He wants her with a vampire. A man like that is unsettled mentally when things don't go as he planned. Ryan rubbed his chin. So he knows that what we told him is real, but he wants to publicly blame it on witches so that he has an excuse to take her back? Tom Tom shrugged. Or he still believes you have found some other way to trick her into loving the wolf. Ryan slammed a fist into his palm. How do we know? There's only one way. To confront him. To talk to him. In person. So you can see his eyes and know from them. Like you said, Elder, this vampire is powerful. Extremely powerful. That he is. He could kill us all at any meeting we arrange. Ryan felt his resolve waver. Putting his own life up was one thing. But what if it got even more out of hand? His throat tightened when he thought about what was already happening in Polson because of this. You have all left your families, your pack, to give those two this chance because you believe in it. You know what they have is real. Ryan nodded. Yes, we do. But is that enough? The older man drew in a slow breath and sat back in his seat. Belief is an amazing thing, young one. Ryan gave a small smile at the name, but stayed quiet. The belief of one is mighty, but the belief of the mighty is only as good as their swing. Ryan's brows dipped and Tom Tom chuckled. What did you come here to ask me? Reina doesn't seem to have any memory of her vampire life. Tom Tom gave a soft sigh. So I've heard. The Polson Alpha shrugged. She doesn't even know why we're here. Her memory, it seems to only be of the present. I don't think she even remembers what happened just before we came here. There was a knock on the door and they both turned. It opened and Will walked in. He watched them both for a moment, and then Ryan restated his last comment. The owl saw Alpha nodded. We don't know why she can't remember, he stated, moving towards the fire. Elizabeth had all of her memories. Ryan growled and Tom Tom shrugged. It could be her mind's way of protecting her, letting her deal with this without the distractions. Her life isn't a distraction, Ryan sighed. Her memory loss is no blessing. Phil is holding back because of it. Who could blame him? Tom Tom smiled. He has pride and compassion. Ryan smiled back. He's an amazing wolf. His frown slipped. He can't claim her until he knows that she wants him completely. As honorable as that is, the elder sighed, there's also a fear in him. A fear we can all understand. Will stepped up. He pulls away from her, confusing her. He put a hand up when Ryan's mouth opened. We know why, and I admire the strength needed to do it. But she doesn't. They should both be enjoying their love, and yet circumstances have made it so they can't. Completely. And if we fill those holes in her memory? I have always thought about that. As the name implies, Aote brings together two souls that were always meant to be together, Tom Tom said, with a small smile. I don't believe that it could force two people together. I have seen others fall in love, and fall out of love, he shrugged. You can't force true love. You can't trick it for long. Lust, desperation, loneliness, those can trick the mind and heart. Aote is the greatest love there is. I believe it binds two hearts that have been searching for each other and graces those around it enough to show them the difference. Ryan smiled a bit, then chuckled. So you're confident that, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the oldest wolf said before he could finish, you telling her will not stop that love. It will hurt her, She'll have to deal with those memories, but she'll have to do that no matter what. So, we should tell her? That's up to you. Ryan frowned, looking at the floor in front of him. It just seems there's more to all of this. Then there probably is. The younger wolf chuckled. Elder Tom Tom, you enjoy speaking so only you can understand, don't you? Sometimes, the other smiled back. It can be amusing at times. But think on this. It's no secret that vampires hold tight reins on your people, our people. When Ryan looked up, the other shrugged. His face smiled when he slowly worked his chains around you and your pack, making you dependent on him without even realizing it. Perhaps, Tom Tom leaned forward again, perhaps he knew long ago that this would happen. Ryan's body stiffened and his heart raced. How could he was finally able to whisper. I didn't say that he did, Tom Tom shrugged, suddenly standing up. But you implied that he might, Ryan shot out. The elder shuffled to the wall and collected his walking stick. Will moved towards the door. Ryan shook his head. You know more, or the dreamers have dreamt more than you're telling me, he hissed, his fear for his pack mixing with his frustration. If you know, you must tell me. If a man steps into a fire, and another man tells him the fire will burn him, how does that change anything? There was a sadness in the old wolf's voice and his eyes as he turned and reached for the handle. No, Ryan stated, softer this time, stepping up next to the other. Please, if you know something that will help. Knowing too much does not always help, young one, Tom Tom said, his voice tight and low with emotion. If you were told you would die tomorrow, what would you do? When Ryan didn't answer, the older wolf looked at him, his eyes watering now. You would fight to change it. Would you hide to escape it, or would you spend your final days loving, laughing, and enjoying all that you have? Ryan only blinked and Tom Tom turned the handle. And, is any one of those choices better than the other? With that, he opened the door and stepped out. Will followed him quietly. Ryan watched them for a second, then shook his head and rushed out. You don't owe us anything, he whispered, cautious of those that were close enough to hear. But I beg you, if you know what'll happen, or what we should do. Tom Tom sighed heavily, looking out towards the bonfire that was being allowed to slowly burn itself down. A pebble was thrown, long ago, into the world we are a part of. We have been living through the ripples it has created. Sometimes another pebble is thrown and creates its own set of ripples. When the two meet, who can say what will happen? He smiled sadly. Will the ripples separate? Will they create yet another set? Will they merge? The possibilities are limitless. Then he looked up. If someone said, I see that you will throw that stone, how would that help you? I still don't understand, Ryan hissed, lowering his head and moving closer to the man. Perhaps that's better. Then you will not be swayed and will do what's in your heart to do. He put a hand up when Ryan's jaw clenched. I am an old man and not a dreamer. Dear Al sees only her in his dreams, so please do not seek him. He adores her already, has before she came. He knows nothing of what will happen. Then he shrugged, patted Ryan's shoulder, and headed down the path. Will gave him a small nod. I don't envy you your decision, but remember, we'll stand with you no matter what. With that, he turned and left as well, heading around the back of the cabin. Ryan stood and watched him walk away, his mind swimming with the conversation. Could it be that her father actually knew about Aote and even believed in it? If so, he obviously didn't know very much about it, or he would be welcoming Phil as a son instead of trying to get his daughter as far away from him as possible. He growled his frustration and then saw Cal and his clique near the bonfire. Ryan replayed the elder's last comment and then headed for the boys. They stood when he approached, and he stopped with his eyes firmly on Cal. The others quickly murmured excuses and walked away. Ryan watched them go, not really seeing them, his mind still racing with the bits of information. Cal shifted his weight, and Ryan turned. "Why didn't you tell me you and your brother are dreamers?" The younger wolf shrugged. "Why bother? You would just demand I tell you things I don't know, just like you're about to do." There was no anger in his words. In fact, he seemed sad. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What have you seen?" "Not much," Cal stated, shoving his hands in his jean pockets and looking around. When a few men walked by, Ryan waited, his eyes following them. They were no threat, but his mind was trying desperately to sort out this information. When they passed, he turned back. "You need to tell me what you know." "It's just the same few dreams," the other whispered back, his eyes moving towards the cabin where the rest of Ryan's pack were. Ryan nodded and explained how Tom told him about the one on the path. Cal shrugged, but nodded. "Then one was of that SUV driving into our camp," he stated, pointing over to where Ryan's car was just parked. "Just driving here?" "Yeah, but I knew it was you. Well, I knew it was her and her pack." He seemed embarrassed, and Ryan's anger ebbed. He took a deep breath and calmed down. "Whatever you know may help her." Cal chuckled. "Dreamers can't tell the future, and I'm not even a dreamer." When Ryan frowned, the other shrugged. "I've had maybe a handful of dreams in my life. I doubt that would qualify me as one." "You said a few dreams." "About her, well, about this," he shrugged again. "The other is about that same SUV driving down a road. It passes a small dirt patch, and in it are—" He sighed and looked up. "3 graves." Ryan's eyes widened, and Cal shrugged nervously. "That's it. I don't know what that means. If the obvious is true, I don't know who's in those graves. All I see is what I told you." He looked down at his hands. "There has to be more," Ryan whispered, feeling his heart beat in his chest. Cal shook his head slowly and then nodded in contrast. 2 of the graves were complete, filled with fresh dirt and quiet, but the 3rd was only half dug. "Half dug?" Cal nodded again. "Yeah, with a shovel lying next to it, like maybe the 3rd won't die but will come close," Ryan tried, searching for something. "Or like the digger was pausing to see if the 3rd would be needed." Cal rubbed his hands together nervously. "Like I said, I don't know what it means. Just what I saw. For all I know, it's only symbolic and has nothing to do with anyone actually dying at all." The Alpha gave a low growl. Dreamers were indeed rare, but what they saw was always right. If the wolf in front of him was, in fact, a dreamer, then 2, possibly 3, would die. The weight around his neck got heavier. Could he bear that responsibility? It would be better if the 3 were vampires, but even then, which 3? Would he feel okay being part of anyone's death? "Al dreams about Reina?" The younger wolf nodded. "Only about her?" Again a nod. "Why is that?" "I have no idea," Cal sighed, pulling his hands out and gesturing outward. "This is what I meant. Someone knows we have the dreams and they want answers. I don't dream except for these few. Al does more than I do, but it's usually kid stuff, like his wagon before he built it, or one time he knew that we would have a hard winter, so we were able to get ready. I wish I could ask the right questions, go to sleep, and wake up with the answers, he stated, his voice cracking a bit at the end. Ryan drew in a breath and nodded. He was desperate for direction, was only finding more questions. Dreamers, aote, both things thought lost to legend. He cracked his neck, looking back towards the cabin where his wolves waited. Cal moved up next to him. I meant what I said. We will come with you. Stand with you. Ryan nodded and headed towards the cabin, not turning to look back at him. His mind was too busy trying to plan. Cal stayed with him, though, and Ryan finally turned to him when they reached the cabin, waiting. I was wondering, he looked nervous now, his hands back in his pockets. Poulsen. The Alpha's eyes widened, and Cal only shrugged. My pack knows I want out of here, he whispered. Maybe just for a while, to see. Ryan smiled then, seeing something of himself flicker in the other's eyes. This wolf had lived here in these woods all his life. The trips to town probably only sparked his interest. He wanted to know what it was like, out there. When this is over, he stated, hiding his smile, and if your Alpha allows it, you're welcome to come visit any time. Cal's brown eyes lit up, and Ryan had to chuckle. He opened the door and walked in, Cal turning and trotting down the path. When he closed the door, he winced as all the eyes were hard on him. An image of 3 graves flashed in his mind, and he swallowed hard. That's where I'm going to stop.